Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we are doing a seismic piece of non-fiction. We are doing the untold lives of the 5 women murdered by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. If you're not familiar with this book yet, then well, you should be. This book was a sensation when it was published end of 2018, beginning of 2019. It is a revolutionary reclamation of history that upset ripperologists and misogynists around the world. Hallie Rubenhold was subject to a lot of online misogyny and online threats, but this book has revolutionized the discussions around the women murdered by the murderer who came to be known as Jack the Ripper, and also has caused us as a society to really question how even today we discuss murders and crime victims, and how the sensationalism remains always on the excitement around who the killer is, what their strategy was, what kind of messed up individual they were, rather than to focus on the lives lost. And never ever has that been more true than with Jack the Ripper. This is an individual who the murders were in 1888 and were over 130-40 years later, and he remains the most notorious killer in history, really. He is a figure of fiction almost now. He is mythical, and that has only emphasized the dehumanization and almost just the not only misrepresentation but actually the complete forgetting of the women whose lives he brutally ended. And Hallie Rubenhold is a historian who decided enough's enough, and much in line with a lot of cultural discourse at the moment that looks at women's place in history and is uncovering and reclaiming parts of history and women's place in it. This is a really important piece of work that actually takes the 5 known as the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. I'm going to try and remember their names now. I think it's Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, that's right, and Mary Jane. So the 5 women generally considered to be definitely killed by the person who came known as Jack the Ripper. And she looks at their lives. She goes through an extraordinary amount of historical evidence to piece together what these women's lives were like, where they start. She follows them from cradle to their brutal end in 1888. This is not a book about Jack the Ripper. This is a book about Polly, Annie, Catherine, Mary Jane, and Elizabeth. This looks at the lives they led from poverty. Some of them went, up several classes, worked in estates, they had married, had children, fell on hard times, had good times, fell out with siblings, fell in love. This is a beautiful sort of, I don't want to keep saying reclaiming, but brings their women back their dignity that was lost for them. And actually that's a really good position for me to start, because I just want to read from you an excerpt from Hallie herself at the beginning of the book, where she talks about what led her onto this journey. This is where I'm going to kick myself for not actually hitting the page. Okay, right, ready? Jack the Ripper killed prostitutes, or so it has always been believed, but there is no hard evidence to suggest that 3 of his 5 victims were prostitutes at all. As soon as the bodies were discovered in dark yards or streets, the police assumed that they were prostitutes, that they had been killed by a maniac who had lured them there to these places for sex. There is and never was any proof of this either. On the contrary, it was ascertained in the course of the coroner's inquest that Jack the Ripper never had sex with his victims. Additionally, in the case of each murder, there were no signs of struggle, and the killings appeared to have taken place in complete silence. Now, this assumption that Jack the Ripper killed sex workers, you just accept this as fact, but Hallie rips this apart in this book, and only one of them was an active sex worker at the time when she was killed in 1888. The others one might have dabbled in sex work to get by in really hard times, but some of the others had nothing to do with it. And it was really beyond ripperologists to get their head around that impoverished women, just like impoverished men, had to sleep on the streets when they could not afford lodging and boarding. And this is another side aspect of the 5 which I absolutely fell in love with. In addition to Hallie's really beautiful, tender and excellent historical analysis that really weaves and brings together the life of these women, she has also brought to life Victorian London. In the 1880s, there's always the assumption that Victorian life was quite still and prim and virtuous, and instead Hallie brings to life a riotous London where tens of thousands of people were homeless on the streets every night. This was an era of strikes and protests, of discontent. There were the wealthy in the West End of London, and the East End was full of criminality and poor. Lodging houses, awful boarding houses, pubs, drink, alcohol was everywhere. Alcoholism was rife, criminality was rife, and London still had the docks, and it was this great sort of trade and of different people from different backgrounds in this cauldron of activity and ideas and lives mingled on top of each other. And there's a real sense of this brimming London was just brimful of people and of energy, and how you can see how the sensationalism of these cases when the murders were in 1888, how this gripped a fervent London who were just desperate for salaciousness. And of course the papers fed that with this inaccurate reporting of these women as sex workers that just became gospel, it just became fact, and it completely demeans and erases a lot of these women's existence. And of course that salaciousness and our need for that kind of reporting still exists today. You still see so much gratuitousness in reporting. So anyway, my intention in writing this book is not to hunt and name the killer. I wish instead to retrace the footsteps of 5 women, to consider their experiences within the context of the era, and to follow their paths through both the gloom and the light. They are worth more to us than the empty human shells we have taken them for. They were children who cried for their mothers. They were young women who fell in love. They endured childbirth and the deaths of parents. They laughed and celebrated Christmas. They argued with their siblings. They wept, they dreamed, they hurt, they enjoyed small triumphs. The courses their lives took mirrored that of so many other women at the Victorian age, and yet were so singular in the way they ended. It is for them that I write this book. I do so in the hope that we may now hear their stories clearly and give back to them that which was so brutally taken away with their lives, their dignity. The book is in 5 sections, one for each of the women. And the research must be, Hallie just pieced this together from such detailed research, even of the places where these women lived, where they would have stayed, the people who would have lived next door, the arguments and disruptions they had in their family lives, their marriages, how they fell apart, how they didn't fall apart, how they fell on hard times. Beautifully done. It is an amazing book, but also as a woman I found it incredibly emotional to read and to get under the skin of these women's lives. What I also really liked as well is that it just stops blank at the women's deaths in 1888. It bears no interest whatsoever in Jack the Ripper, who he was. That's completely irrelevant in this book. We don't care. What we care about is the 5, and Hallie Rubenhold does them wonderful justice in this book.